Now, today's review is a little bit different because we have to talk about things like context and reasoning and so on. But before we get to that stuff, let's talk about this. This is the new 2022 Kia Carnival, and it's not just a new Carnival, it's also a new Kia, which is a lot more than just a new car. Not only is it a new Carnival on a new platform with a new powertrain, this is also representative of a new Kia under new stewardship. There's so many new things to talk about with this car that this video is probably going to get a little bit long, but I promise you that it'll all be worth it. My name is AIMAN, ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, and this is our full in-depth review of the new 2022 Kia Carnival. Now, before we get into the review of this car, it's worth talking about context. At 194-ish thousand ringgit, the Carnival is importantly below 200,000 ringgit, and it also offers the most number of seats for the money. Now, some of you may be wondering, why is this more expensive than the Hyundai Starex, and why is it so much cheaper than the Hyundai Staria and the Toyota Velfire and the Toyota Alphard, even though this is a fully imported unit? Now, it's more expensive than the Starex because the Starex is essentially built off of a very commercial platform, which is why it's a lot taller. It's a body-on-frame MPV with power going to the rear wheels with an older engine and a 5-speed automatic gearbox, whereas this sits on a much newer platform. Now, it is 160,000 ringgit cheaper than the Hyundai Staria because of the way this car has been specified. With 11 seats, this car is technically categorized as a commercial vehicle, and so it has commercial vehicle excise duties, which is why Bermaz was able to offer this car at the price that it has. Now, if you're also wondering why this car is more affordable compared to the Japanese competitors, well, it's also down to that specification that I said earlier. Neither the Alphard nor the Velfire are available with this many seats. Now, what does that mean for the consumer? Well, it does mean that there have been some cost optimizations with this car in order to get it to that very attractive price point. But more importantly, at under 200,000 ringgit, this is undoubtedly the best value people mover currently on sale on the Malaysian market. Now, let's get on to the fun stuff. Now, the new Kia Carnival sports Kia's very latest design language. This car was penned by Karim Habib, a man who is famous for things like the current generation K5 Optima, the F generation BMW 7 Series, and so on. This is a man with a huge, very valuable design portfolio, and that definitely comes through with the new Carnival. Up front, you have this incredibly imposing chrome grille with a new interpretation of Kia's tiger nose. The LED headlights are actually integrated very seamlessly into the grille, which makes it look very distinctive. Adding to that, of course, is the LED daytime running light that comes up like this, which also doubles up as the LED indicator. There are also LED fog lights down there. Now, the design of this car was meant to emulate that of an SUV rather than that of an MPV, which is why at the front you also get wide and large chrome garnishes, as well as what looks like a skid plate to make it look less like a boring people carrier and more like a more energetic and engaging SUV. Now, down the side of the new Carnival, you get 18-inch dual-tone alloy wheels wrapped in Continental cross-contact tires in 235/60 R18 sizes. These are basically SUV wheels. Now, because this car was designed to look like an SUV and less of an MPV, that's why you have these very typically SUV proportions with a long bonnet and an A-pillar that's pushed quite a ways back. You also get enormous wing mirrors, which we'll talk about a little bit later, a little bit of silver trim down there, and on the top of the door handles you also get roof rails, and most importantly down the side, this C-pillar garnish. Now, a lot of people are not sure why this is here, and I can tell you why it is. It's because an MPV is slab-sided, and so you need something to break up that monotony. And this geometric pattern is something that is repeated a little bit further in the interior, which we'll talk about when we get there. But more importantly, it really sets off the side of this car, and it especially stands out in colors like this flame red. Just don't get the silver, because then it sort of disappears. Now, at the rear of the new Carnival, it looks very premium. Also, I think the boot's trying to open. Yeah, so that's the smart tailgate function, where if you have the key in your pocket and you stand in the vicinity of the tailgate for about 5 or 6 seconds, it'll auto open without you having to swing your foot underneath the boot. Now, since the car wants me to talk about the space rather than the exterior design, we're going to have to switch it around a little bit. Now, as you can see, this is with the car with all but the 4th row deployed, and when you have it in this sort of setup, you have a large amount of boot space in here, which means if you were to use this as an 8-seater, there is plenty of room back here for luggage. Now, if you do want to use this as an 11-seater, which means also that you have to fold the center seat out, you have to just pull this tab here and use all your weight to do so, and there we go. And then eventually the 4th row will deploy. And back here you do actually have space for 3 people. Now, admittedly, when you have the 4th row up, you will need to negotiate for space with the 2nd and 3rd row, all of which are individually slidable. So you just need to slide them a little bit further forward on both rows so that there is enough room back here for people who have legs. Now, it is worth noting, of course, that once you have the 4th row up, you have absolutely no space back here. Unless you are bringing around dossiers or files or specifically individual pieces of A4 paper, they're not going to fit back here. This is really, really small. Now, I'm going to try and demonstrate the auto tailgate one more time, because if you walk away from the car, it will close. After it beeps a lot, let's complain a bit more, and there we go. And now hopefully we'll be able to talk about the exterior design a little bit more. So as you can see, we do have a light bar, which unfortunately for our market, because these taillights are actually bulb and not LED, which is a mistake that a lot of my colleagues have been making, we don't get the light strip that goes all the way across. Additionally, these bulb type lights up here also double up as the brake lights, which means unfortunately it's not the swishiest looking thing out there. You also get the new 2D Kia logo, but what annoys me more than anything else is the fact that the indicators, reverse lights and rear fog are all down here. Now, in addition to it not looking very smart, it also means that there's a visibility issue, because if your indicators are down here, it's hard to see from a distance away. So if you're trying to change lanes in a traffic jam, for example, and you're trying to alert motorcyclists that you're changing lanes, you might want to take a little bit more time to do so. What is neat, however, is the fact that the rear wiper is tucked away underneath the rear spoiler like a proper premium car, which gives the rear end this lovely, neat look. Now, the thing about an MPV is that it is also about carrying people in relative comfort. But before we do that, let's very quickly touch on the powertrain in a special, separate segment, because it's worth talking about like that. Now, we're going to talk about the powertrain because, like I said earlier, this is a slightly more important thing to talk about. Now, compared to the Toyota Alphard and Velfire, as well as the Toyota Previa and the Honda Odyssey, this is motivated by a turbo diesel engine. This is Hyundai Kia's latest SmartStream D engine, which produces 199 horsepower and 440 Newton meters of torque from a 2.2 litre displacement. Power goes to the front wheels via an 8-speed automatic gearbox. Now, this new powertrain comes on top of a brand new platform. So even though some of you might be comparing this to, say, the Hyundai Starex, this is actually more comparable to the Hyundai Staria, because this is, like I said, a new platform, which this car also shares with the Staria, the Hyundai Palisade, as well as the Kia Optima K5 and Hyundai Sonata. And as a result, there are lots of little refinements in this car which will be more evident once you're out on the open road. Now, onto the interior of the new Kia Carnival. There are lots of nice things to talk about. For starters, let's talk about the interior upholstery. This dual tone upholstery layout, where you have this sort of saddle brown leather in the middle, some black leather down the side and black leather on the dash top, for example, just makes this car feel really premium. Now, in our market, where people prefer black interiors, well, they're left out, because unfortunately this car only comes with the saddle brown and black. Also, for those saying that this is very high quality leather, it is, because it's not leather. This is actually leatherette, but to be fair, it's very high quality leatherette, and because of the stitching and the perforations done in this very beautiful design, the attention to detail in this car is faultless, and so I certainly will not hold anything against it for using faux leather as opposed to real leather. Now that faux leather, of course, extends to the dash top, but as the driver you see very little of it because your view is dominated firstly by this enormous 12.3-inch central touchscreen, which runs the Hyundai Kia infotainment system, which is very intuitive to use. It's very snappy and very responsive. This screen is also very bright and very clear. And if you use the 360-degree camera, it displays very crisp and very beautifully. You also, of course, get Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. Unfortunately, it is through a wired connection, but that said, there is a nice little slot for you to stick your phone in so you can plug it in very easily. Of course, if you're not one to plug your phone in and use Android Auto, there is also a Qi wireless charger in here, which is big enough to fit my rather old Samsung. There is also a lot of cubby spaces in here. You have a couple of very large and deep cup holders here. You've got space here, you've got bottle holders in the doors. There's a very large sort of armrest pocket here where you can fit your wallet. And the center console storage is absolutely ginormous. Now, that's expected for an MPV. What isn't expected for an MPV is the level of fit and finish, as well as the premiumness that you get in here. That metal geometric pattern that we saw outside is repeated on this silver trim, which stretches all the way across the dashboard. There is a piece of silver trim that perfectly integrates the aircon vents, and it all just looks really lovely. You also get triple zone climate control, 2 in the front and 1 in the rear. The rear actually has its own climate control panel, although you can also manipulate it from the front. What is worth noting, however, is that while the temperature controls are via these very satisfying little scroll wheel thingies, unfortunately, the fan speed, the recirculation and so on is all done via capacitive touch, which I'd prefer buttons, but the fact that these capacitive touch buttons are large enough, it does mean that they're very easy to trigger when necessary. The same goes for the buttons for the infotainment system. So even though you have a very large touchscreen, you still have a knob for the volume, a knob to change your track, but you do have capacitive touch buttons, or shortcuts rather, on either side of the emergency stop signal. So you have things like map, navi, radio, media, and so on. And you also have a favorite button, which I've set up for my phone projection. So I can just press that and I already get Android Auto like that. Now, talking about buttons and switchgear, we have to talk about the gear selector, which is not a gear lever, but rather a rotary knob. This is a shift-by-wire system, which means there's no actual physical linkage between this and the powertrain. But Kia has seen it fit to embellish this with a beautiful knurled finish around the gear selector and a sort of almost crystalline type finish along the top, surrounding the park button right in the middle. And this looks really posh. As a major touch point in this car, especially for drivers who will most often be the person who paid for the car, it's very nice to have something premium to touch and hold and feel right here in the middle. Of course, you also have an electronic parking brake, which naturally comes with auto hold, and a drive mode selector, which allows you to choose between normal, eco, sport, and smart. Smart is an adaptive system that sort of figures out what mode you want to be in based on your driving style, and it adapts constantly so that you are always in the right mode for when you need it, which is basically where I'd advise that you leave this car in. Now, in terms of the driving position, both the driver's seat and passenger seat are both powered. You also get an enormous amount of adjustment in the steering wheel for both reach and rake, which means that it's very easy to get comfy. Now, once you are sat here, of course, you have this lovely leather-wrapped steering wheel with all the buttons that you need here. Everything is very intuitive, but you do lay eyes on one of this car's sore points, which is the fact that you still get analog dials in this car. When you look at the design of the dashboard, you can tell that this was made for a digital instrument cluster. But again, Bermaz has been very careful to specify this car in order to ensure that it reaches that sub 200,000 ringgit price point, and so we get a pair of analog dials and a 4.7-inch supervision cluster in the middle. Now, it's not all bad news. Yes, it doesn't look as swish as a digital instrument cluster like what you'd get from the Hyundai Staria, for example, but it's all very legible. You get all the information that you need. All the info from the supervision cluster is also displayed very nicely, and like I said earlier, it's very easy to manipulate via the buttons on the steering wheel. So this really isn't that big of a deal. What's more important in terms of the specification is how Bermaz laid out the rear end of this car. And because this car is so ginormous, we will actually go back there and try every single row of seats. Now, in the back of the Carnival, there is, well, as you can see, plenty of space, as you'd expect for a car that is in excess of 5 meters long. Now, this seat is set up in my driving position, and this seat is pushed all the way back, the furthest rearward position, and there is actually still enough room in the third row for adults. Now, like this, I have acres of knee room and acres of headroom, and it is worth noting that these two outer pews get 3-point seat belts and ISOFIX mounts. Now, I mentioned the seat belts because this center jump seat, although you can recline the backrest in order to get a little bit more comfortable, unfortunately it only comes with a lap belt, which means we officially cannot recommend anyone to be seated in the middle. So when you're not using this as a seat, you can fold this forward, and you have a nice drinks table where you have a couple of cup holders, a couple of smartphone holders, and a large central space for you to put snacks or something. And more importantly, when you're not using this as a table, you want access to the third row without folding the middle seats, you can actually pull this tab, which is very tough because it's a very new car, and then at some point, yes, there we go, it can lift up to the side, and so it creates a central walkway of sorts, which allows you to access the third and fourth rows. Of course, the third row has this as well. Now, in order to demonstrate the third and fourth row, we have to do a little bit of meandering and management of the seats here. So I'm going to first pull this to a position where I'll be comfortable. There you go, and I can still slot my feet underneath, and then I need to pull this seat to match, which is not easy. No, it's a little bit more. There we go. And now we can talk about the third row. Now, life in the third row is not quite as plush as it is in the second row. Now, I've adjusted these seats so that the fourth row has enough space for human beings, and the second row has been adjusted so that there's also space in the third row for human beings. And sat here, for starters, the floor is quite high, which means you have very little under thigh support. You have a reasonable amount of knee room and headroom. But what is worth noting is that this seat is actually adjustable. If I can find the lever for it, which is here, so there we are. You can actually recline these seats. There we go. And you can actually sit quite comfortably in here. So once I'm in this position, actually the lack of under thigh support becomes less of a problem. Now, as I said earlier, the middle seat can of course be folded out as a table, or you can fold it up in order to make a pass through to the third row. And to be honest, back here, life is still all right. You still have cup holders here, you have a USB port, you still have aircon vents for the second and third row, and like I said, the seat is reclinable just like the second row. Now, from here, you probably noticed the rear sun blinds, which are also available on the second row, ensuring that all rear passengers can be very comfortable in here. And now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go and finagle myself into the fourth row so that I can be considered as a thorough motoring journalist, where I am now. Now, the fourth row of seats, please only put children back here, because the amount of knee room is, I mean, I've got just enough space to tuck my feet in underneath the row in front, but my knees are almost pressed up against the third row, and in terms of headroom, it isn't great either. My head actually rests sort of beyond the cut line for the rear hatch, which means if the boot were to open, then my head would get a little bit more space. What also troubles me, of course, is the fact that I can barely wedge a finger between the rear headrest on the side and the rear windscreen, which means if the sun were beating down back here, it isn't going to be fun. This is, of course, made worse by the fact that there isn't aircon vents for the fourth row, so you'll have to argue with the person in front of you in order to get those vents to blow air at you. And once you're back here, there are very few amenities available to you. For starters, this fourth row does not have child seat anchors, which means you do not want to put car seats back here. There is a cubby space sort of here and here where you can put things, but there are no cup holders available to you. So again, you'll have to make sure that this is down so that you have space to put things. Now, in terms of power, there is a 12-volt socket back here, but you'll need an adapter for it. But otherwise, you can just unplug the USB cable for the guy in front and then stick yours in there to charge your devices. Now, like I said earlier, this car is better designed as an 8-seater with an occasional fourth row, because in that setup, there is plenty of legroom for everyone sat within. But with this fourth row deployed, you do not want to put people back here for any more than about an hour or so, because it may get very tiring and very uncomfortable. What is worth noting, however, is that because these seats are laid out in such a way where every row is higher than the other, even sat back here, you get a great view out, and you still get relatively large quarter lights for you to see out of. And as I said earlier, you can just look out the very expansive rear windscreen. Now, that so concludes our very extensive tour of the inside of the Kia Carnival mansion. And so now we have to get behind the wheel where I can turn on the air conditioning and talk about the driving experience. Now, getting behind the wheel of the Kia Carnival is, well, it reveals that this is certainly not every other MPV. So for starters, like I mentioned earlier, this interior feels really posh and really well screwed together, and that really does extend to the drive. This car is surprisingly refined. Sure, when you're stationary, there is a little bit of vibration from the diesel engine, but in all honesty, once you start moving, there is almost nothing heard from the engine room up ahead. And that certainly does make for a very posh experience, understanding the fact that there is an engine whizzing away up there, but without allowing it to sort of interrupt the serenity in the cabin. Now, what also does help sort of the driving experience is the performance. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this car is about 199 horsepower and 440 Newton meters of torque, with power going to the front wheels via an 8-speed automatic gearbox. Now, 440 Newton meters of torque is certainly a very large figure, and the fact that all of that torque is available from just 1,750 RPM means that it is very accessible, and so it is something that you'll be using quite often. Now, if you compare this to cars like the Hyundai Starex, which has definitely less power and less torque, and you were to compare it to vehicles like the Toyota Alphard and Velfire, which use naturally aspirated petrol engines, this car definitely has the jump on them. Now, what is worth noting, of course, is the fact that this car is not really about the 0 to 100 sprint. Rather, it's about going from 60 to 120. Because of all that torque, the in-gear shove that this car has is fantastic. It makes overtaking a very easy and simple affair. It also makes high-speed cruising on the motorway a very easy affair as well, because it's very easy for you to get up to cruising speeds, and then once you're there, you just set the cruise control and the car is quite happy to sit there all day long. Now, I've had the opportunity to drive this car over a longer distance, and I can tell you that it is incredibly efficient as well. Because of the gearing of the gearbox, as well as the brawniness of this engine, it does mean that even when you're cruising at about 130 thereabouts, if you were to do so, the fuel consumption in this car still remains relatively low. On a quick trip to Port Dickson and back, with very little traffic, although there was some nonetheless, plus a little bit of idling, this car was still returning about 7.3 litres per 100 kilometers, which is most certainly a very impressive figure for a vehicle like this. Now, of course, when you are cruising on the motorway, you will be wondering about NVH. So I did mention earlier about refinement, and this car certainly does extend that refinement beyond just what you see in the interior. In terms of wind noise, it only really creeps in at speeds above 130. And as for road noise, well, it can either be very quiet or it can be very noisy. It actually depends more on the road surface rather than the tires themselves. The Continental cross-contact tires on this car do a very good job at keeping road noise relatively minimal. But of course, if you are on a particularly coarse road, then there is going to be some noise intrusion into the cabin. What is incredible is the fact that the refinement isn't just limited to just the front seats, because even in the second, third and fourth rows, it still remains relatively quiet. Now, in terms of the drive, I'm going to preface this by saying that even though this is a very good car to drive, there are some parts of this that you simply cannot mask. The fact that this is a vehicle that's almost 2 meters wide and over 5 meters long, it does mean that when you're behind the wheel, you have to be aware of this car's size, and sometimes it can fool you into thinking that it's not really that big, especially when you're on the motorway and stuff like that. But the moment you hit a corner, all of that comes rushing back. For starters, it's a very heavy vehicle, and while the brakes are very, very good at bringing this car to a halt, you can feel some of the weight and the momentum of this car sort of fighting back as you hit the anchors. And of course, through corners, this car's body control is absolutely excellent. It actually drives more like an SUV than it does an MPV in that regard. But despite that, of course, you will still feel the heft of this car. That's just something that you simply cannot run away from. But if you understand how this vehicle is, or its dynamic characteristics, then it makes life a lot easier. Just scrub the speed Oh, there's a bike going past. Just scrub the speed before you hit the corner and everything will be fine. Slow in, fast out. And because of this car's enormous diesel engine, it does mean that leaving a corner with speed should not be a very difficult affair either. Now, in terms of the overall size and practicality, now as an 11-seater, this car is a little bit flawed. The fourth row is very small, and no matter how you negotiate or rearrange the pews ahead of it, it's very difficult to get a reasonable amount of room back there. I would use the third row as an occasional set of seats, not something to be deployed regularly. Now, treating it as an 8-seater, it is a lot better. So for starters, all 3 rows, naturally the front seats included, are very comfortable for adults, and for the second and third row, the outer seats do come with ISOFIX mounts, which means that you can mount a child seat or a booster seat in there for babies and toddlers. And the fact that this car has air conditioning vents over the second and third row also means that passengers will be kept relatively comfortable. And again, with a little bit of shuffling, all passengers can enjoy decent legroom. The only caveat, of course, is the fact that the middle seats, the ones that can fold and tumble, those seats only come with lap belts, as I mentioned earlier. And so I wouldn't advise putting people in them because lap belts are not particularly safe. And the reason why this car has lap belts is because it is classified as a commercial vehicle. That's why it came as an 11-seater in the first place. And through commercial vehicle regulations, it is acceptable to have lap belts. Now, this is going to be updated and changed with the CKD model. As we understand, this car will be available as a 7 and 8-seater, which will also change the seat railings and mountings for this car, which means it should be even more comfortable for passengers. And of course, all of those seats should be replete with 3-point seat belts. But all in all, as a 6+2-seater, this car is very comfortable. I did load this car up completely full, and none of my passengers were complaining about discomfort. It was always a matter of this car is very comfortable, this car is very quiet, it's very refined, and of course, thanks to this engine, it's also very fast, which means you can actually keep up with traffic on the motorway even when you have this car fully laden. Now, of course, it's not all roses and good news. There are some aspects that this car does sort of fall short on, and that is in terms of safety. Now, the Kia Carnival comes as standard with blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, and safe exit alert, which will stop the sliding doors from opening should it detect a vehicle passing when this vehicle is in park and the other vehicle is driving in excess of 5 kilometers an hour or something to that effect. And I have demonstrated that system, and I do know that it does work. Unfortunately, that is the full extent of the safety systems in this car. You don't get autonomous emergency braking, you don't get lane keep assist, you don't get adaptive cruise control, and I feel like these omissions, especially autonomous emergency braking, is a little bit erroneous in that regard. Now, if this were a sports car, for example, then it's fine if it doesn't come with AEB because it's a sports car. Your priority is things like lightness and dynamics, and so naturally you would want all the effort to be spent and sort of put in that direction. Unfortunately, in this car, this is, for all intents and purposes, a family car. And in a family car, I would want my family to be protected via an extra pair of active safety eyes when I'm behind the wheel. So things like lane keep assist and AEB, especially AEB, it feels like a requirement in a modern car these days, and the fact that it's not available in this Carnival is noteworthy. Now, if you were to compare this to competition like the Toyota Innova or even the Toyota Previa, you will notice that actually AEB is very difficult to find in cars of this size. But that said, I do feel like Bermaz Auto is capable of speccing up these cars the way they ought to be, the way they have done with their Mazda products. And so it is a little bit disappointing that they didn't do so for this car, although I suspect that they will do so come the CKD model. So all in all, what do I think of the new Kia Carnival? Well, this engine is superb. This powertrain is a perfect match for a big MPV like this. This interior feels really posh and really upmarket, and more than that, it also feels very well screwed together, which means it is the sort of car that will stand the test of time even with the rigors and abuse that comes with family life. Would I recommend this? Absolutely. The fuel consumption in this car alone, over the 813 kilometers that I've driven it, has been a very astounding 7.5 liters per 100 kilometers, and you can only get figures like that in a diesel car like this. On top of that, the sheer amount of force available to you when you're on the motorway driving or cruising at high speed and you need to overtake, that is something that once you experience it, it's very hard to live without. No atmospheric petrol engine or even a turbocharged petrol engine can come close to the sort of in-gear shove that this car has, and that definitely does make this a much better motorway cruiser than others. And because of the responsiveness of the powertrain and the directness of the steering, it does mean that even in town, this is not a difficult vehicle to drive. The excellent visibility also helps aid smaller people like myself drive a vehicle this big. And ultimately, if you are looking at a large MPV, then I would go as far as to say this is the best large MPV currently available on the market, and you would be stupid to overlook it or ignore it. In any case, that's been our review of the 2022 Kia Carnival. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe. Jangan bodoh.